So as I mentioned, I'm part of a Mennonite congregation, and a beloved member of my little Mennonite church is dying of lung cancer. She recently went on to hospice care, and folks are having a very hard time accepting that there aren't more treatment options that she can try to explore. So we're struggling because she is a very dear member of this little group. She's part of a small group that I'm in. Do you use the Soul Matters materials here? We do a Soul Matters group there as well. So we meet on Zoom, about 6 or 8 of us once a month, to explore these deep questions about spiritual growth and exploration. And at our Zoom meeting several months ago, during her time to share, she mentioned that she has been surprised to find that people do not shy away from the topic of death when they talk with her. In fact, she's been surprised to find that people are actually eager to talk about death with her. And then she said something that really woke me up. When you're talking to people about death, she said, it's really important that you bring all your joy to the conversation. Now, those of you who've been in a Soul Matters group know that it's not a group with a lot of discussion that goes on. It's one where people share one by one and just really listen to each other. And then she had to leave the meeting early. So I didn't get the chance to ask her just what she meant by that. And then for a long time, she was too weak and tired to have visitors. So until I could talk with her again, I had to take that comment and sit with it and come to my own conclusions. I got the clear impression that she was finding all those conversations about death difficult. Not because she's afraid of death. I'm quite sure she's not. And not because she's in denial about her own death. I know she's not. But because people approach the conversation so very seriously. They've become afraid to laugh or be silly in her presence. They feel so somber. And I think what I heard her saying was, bring me your joy. Be fully alive with me as we talk about death. I think what I heard her saying was, please don't act as if I'm already dead. It's hard to bring our joy to conversations about death. That's true when we're being literal, when we're talking with a good friend who is in fact dying. It's also true on a more metaphorical level too, when we're facing any kind of big, scary, painful things. The state of the world, the state of our country, the fragility of our lives. I remember when the war in Ukraine was first unfolding, the horror of what was happening when it was still so shockingly fresh and new. The devastating photographs of the refugee children carrying alone, people fleeing with their pets strapped to their bodies, men who were staying behind to fight, weeping as they said goodbye to their children. It was so hard to look at those pictures. And yet I felt as though in all my helplessness, at least I could stand witness somehow and look honestly at what was happening. And at the exact same time that that was going on, we were having the most glorious spring weather here. Green was bursting out everywhere. The bird song was beginning to ring out in the early mornings as I was reading these articles full of war and pain and suffering. And the contrast was so sharp and so painful. And I couldn't help but feel joy at the beauty of what was happening all around me. And then I felt so guilty to be experiencing joy when so many others were in such despair. But my sister sent me an article from the New York Times by a writer named Margaret Renkel. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. She's a Southern woman. She writes a lot about the natural world. And in this article, she was writing of the tension of experiencing the joy and beauty of the spring, even as we know that the earth itself is in peril, that we as humans are largely responsible for that peril, and that so much of the greenery that is lifting her heart is actually the result of invasive species that are doing damage. And she knows that she does not deserve the joy that she is experiencing. And yet she writes, I refuse to quell this joy. It's possible to understand what invasive species are doing to the woods and still feel the leaping heart of joy in greenness. It's entirely possible to understand what human beings are doing to the woods and to one another in this moment of dread and grief and terrible struggle, and still exult in birdsong and tiny blooming flowers peeking out from the dead leaves of autumn. In this troubled world, it would be a crime to snuff out any flicker of happiness that somehow leaps into life. And then she goes on to say, we are creatures built for joy. At the very saddest funerals, we can hear a funny story about our lost beloved, and God help us, we laugh. We can stagger out of an appointment where a person in a white coat has given us the news we think we cannot bear to hear, and still we smile at the baby in the checkout line, clapping her chubby hands at the balloons by the cash register, or kicking her feet in joy at a stranger's smile. This is who we are, the very best of who we are. And she closes by saying, turn your face up to the sky. Listen, the world is shivering into possibility. The world is reminding us that this is what the world does best. New life, rebirth, the greenness that rises out of ashes. We are creatures built for joy, she says, even in the midst of sorrow and pain. When I was growing up in our little humanist UU fellowship, we sang that haunting hymn every night and every morn. Do some of you know it? The music is from Ralph Vaughan Williams and the poetry from William Blake. And it has the line, joy and woe are woven fine, clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. And then it goes on to say, it is right, it should be so. We are made for joy and woe. And when this we rightly know, safely through the world we go. Yes, we are creatures built for joy. We are built for joy and woe. As I thought about it, I realized there were really two different circumstances where I have a lot of trouble living into that reality that joy and woe are woven fine. Times when I find it hard to bring my joy to those hard conversations. Sometimes it's when I'm in the presence of someone else's pain or suffering. I may be aware of joy in my own life, but it can feel inappropriate or even disrespectful somehow to acknowledge that joy. How dare I feel joy when my friend is dying, when refugees are running from the bombs, when the earth is on fire? It's also a struggle to bring my joy, or even to be aware of any joy, when I'm trapped in my own personal fear or pain or sorrow. It's so easy to think that those realities are all there is. When we're facing really hard things in our personal lives, whether it's our own death, our own safety, our own grief, it can be very hard to connect with joy. There's a line I love in a children's book called The Knowing Book, where the narrator is reminding the reader to trust their life and live with courage and confidence. And she writes, there is magic around you, but it hides. Sometimes the magic in life feels very well hidden, and we can lose sight of any possibility of joy. And yet the claiming of joy, even in the midst of death, literal or metaphorical, is an imperative of the spiritual life. The Buddhist story that I used for our reading this morning makes that point in an unmistakable way. It's a classic Zen teaching story, and there are many, many versions of it. I picked one that felt comfortable to me to use, but if you go online and look around for the monk and the tiger and the strawberry, you'll find many different versions. I found an interesting commentary on it by a Dr. Munri Kazmir. He's a Pakistani medical doctor and a humanitarian. And it seemed to me that pretty much everything on the website was his own writing, but at the end of the piece it also said contributing writer Brooke Bell, so I want to name her too, just in case. Dr. Kazmir points out that this very well-known story is really hard for most people. He writes that most of us don't like this story. Indeed, even devout students of Zen Buddhism struggle with this teaching and its meaning. Most particularly in societies heavily influenced by Hollywood, modern tastes generally run more toward the happy ending. We want the mouse to speak, perhaps offer to save the man in some magical bargain. We want the strawberry to transform the man into a bird who flies away to safety. But most of all, we just can't stand the ending of The Tiger and the Strawberry. The most burning question left unanswered, dangling, what happens to the man? Except, he says, we already know what happens to the man. Of course we do. He dies. Dr. Kazmir goes on to remind us that the monk's plight in this story is exactly the same plight of all of us every day. Given how unlikely it was statistically that we would ever evolve into life in the first place, and how perilous life is, we really shouldn't be here at all. As he puts it, considering that we are here, and considering that we really won't be around all that long, even if we die of extreme old age, this should instill a profound sense of appreciation for the present moment. There is no staying off that cliff. There is no avoiding those tigers forever. The mouse of inexorable time is chewing away at our lifeline minute by minute. The only choice is whether or not we will notice, eat, and enjoy the strawberry. Because whether we enjoy or ignore it, we're still getting eaten by that tiger. And then he closes with a quotation from the Buddhist monk Pema Chodron. Tigers above, tigers below. This is actually the predicament that we are always in terms of our birth and our death. Each moment is just what it is. It might be the only moment of our life. It might be the only strawberry we'll ever eat. We could get depressed about it, or we could fully appreciate it and delight in the preciousness of every single moment of our life. The monk in our story quite literally brought all his joy to a conversation about death. If you know anything at all about Buddhism, you probably know they don't shy away from talking about death and living our life within the context of acknowledging our coming death, meditating on death. But I think this is also an important part of the message of Christianity and that journey from crucifixion to resurrection. Much of what I'm about to say gets lost in traditional Christian theology, which puts so much emphasis on the resurrection as a literal event that defeated death. In the Mennonite church on Easter, one of the hymns says, "For Jesus has risen and we shall not die." But of course we will die. We all know we will die. Everybody who sings that hymn knows they're going to die. For me, the real message is that even in the face of such terrible suffering, joy can still arise. Not a literal resurrection that overcomes death, but a rising of the spirit that is not stifled by death. Now, this isn't a sermon on the UU understandings of the resurrection. If you want that, you can invite me back next Easter. But I believe that Jesus lived out of a deep conviction of what was right, of what he felt God was calling him to model for other people, a realm of love and healing and hope. And that even in their deep grief and fear after his death, his disciples felt the ongoing presence of that love and hope and the joy that it brought them. sort of a cosmic version of the way we are able to laugh at the funeral of someone we loved so deeply. Throughout our lives, we face very real pain and suffering and fear. This is not a Pollyanna sermon saying, oh, just look on the bright side and count your blessings. But it is a reminder that in the midst of that pain and suffering and fear, we are still called to honor and experience joy as well. To do so is not a betrayal of those who suffer. It's not a denial of the hardship of our own lives. It takes courage to look for joy when things are at their worst. But staying in touch with the joy is what sustains us through the struggle and gives us the energy then to work for all that is still beautiful and good in our own fragile lives and in this beautiful and broken world that we share. Earlier this year, I attended the installation of my colleague, the Reverend McKinley Sims, down at the UU Church of the Restoration, now the UU Congregation of Mount Airy. And my beloved colleague, Kent Mathias, gave the charge to the congregation. He charged them, and I quote, to transform lives as disciples of love, courage, and hope. And he gave them 3 very specific ways that they should do that. And the first was to keep on loving life. And here's what he said. Celebrate life like David, who danced before the Lord with all his might. Sing like Mercedes Sosa, gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, thanks to life which has given me so much. Engage with beauty for the sake of beauty. Listen to Mozart and Marsalis. Exalt in the paintings of Botero and Modigliani. Take hikes along the blazing azaleas in the Wissahickon. Loving life will keep your soul battery full. Loving life will help you live out and share the truth of resurrection. You don't have to wait for a heavenly chariot to take you away to some far-off land. By growing, learning, and changing, you can be born into being more fully alive right now. We can be born again and again and again. So I say, along with my colleague Kent, keep on loving life. Our challenging, perilous, sometimes devastating life. Our life is going to be full of conversations about death, literal or figurative. There's always pain and there's always sorrow, because we're all always dying. But loving life will help us live out and share the truth of resurrection and the fact that we can be born again and again and again. I was finally able to visit my dear friend, the one who reminded me to bring all my joy to conversations about death. And we did indeed end up talking about death, but we also relished the beauty of our surroundings and the beauty of our friendship. We affirmed life and we laughed a lot. We summoned our courage and we brought all our joy to the conversation. And so may we all, today and every day.